I clearly had a very sinful life in a previous life because I've been condemned to spending almost 50 years now working in Washington on national security issues. And it gives you a very different perspective than the perspective one gets from working outside and in the kinds of organizations that my colleagues work at. We don't talk about morality in Washington unless it's personal morality of various individuals, but certainly not about issues. It's really quite remarkable. There's been a debate, as you know, for a year about whether the U.S. should go to war with Iran to prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons, and no one ever mentions morality. I wrote a letter which the Washington Post published to my shock saying, don't you think we ought to consider whether this is the right thing to do, to start another war, and what's the moral basis for it? It caused a great stir in Washington. But I've worked on nuclear issues, both in government. I was part of the negotiating team that talked to the Soviet Union during the Carter administration and negotiated an early arms control agreement, and I've written about these issues from different think tanks for many, many years. I founded the Stimson Center, which is a think tank about 25 years ago almost, with a kind of different approach in mind. Our slogan is pragmatic steps toward ideal objectives, which is taken from something Henry Stimson wrote. So we have ideal goals, nuclear disarmament, but we work toward them through seeking pragmatic steps toward that end. But for most of the time, this meant working not for disarmament, but for arms control, for limited agreements to reduce nuclear arsenals, and to, in other ways, like establishing communications channels to reduce the risk of nuclear war. But then the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War ended, and we went, gee, maybe we could begin to talk about disarmament. Now, it's an old saying in Washington that the way you can get almost anything done if you'll give other people credit for it. So the first thing we did in the mid-90s was to put together a group of very distinguished people to look at this question of is it time to consider eliminating nuclear weapons? And we recruited General Andrew Goodpaster, who was President Eisenhower's national security advisor, to chair the group, and it had all these Cold War figures, Paul Nitze, who was the man who really put the U.S. on the road toward military-industrial complex in the 50s, and Robert McNamara was a member. And this group came out in 1995 and said the U.S. should move gradually to eliminate nuclear weapons. And, we went, okay, we've accomplished something. But Washington completely dismissed it. It was not taken seriously in policy circles at all. They went, oh, poor Paul Nitze, he's old, he's kind of losing it. He forgot how important these weapons are. But then a terrible thing happened, but in a way, a fortunate thing, the attack on 9/11. And people began to say, oh, the U.S. is vulnerable to terrorist attacks. What if they had nuclear weapons? This is a terrible threat. And I agree, one of the speakers said that nuclear terrorism is perhaps not the greatest threat we face, and I agree with that, but it is certainly a very powerful motivating factor in terms of moving the policy community toward taking nuclear disarmament seriously. So we saw the so-called Gang of Four, and even Henry Kissinger came out for nuclear disarmament, George Shultz, all these famous Republican statesmen. And then, of course, in a few years ago in Prague, President Obama articulated the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons as a goal of U.S. policy. And this was a wonderful moment, we all thought. And all we need to do now is to follow up and achieve that. The risks of nuclear weapons are magnified because of the deterioration in the regime which has prevented the spread of those weapons for these many decades that they've existed. Back in John F. Kennedy's time, the government and experts were predicting that there would be 20 or 30 states with nuclear weapons by the end of the last century. Well, we only have 9 now, but 13 years ago, we only had 6. So we've gone from 6 to 9 in not that too long ago, and there's the risk that Iran will become the 10th nuclear weapon state in another few years. There's also been the weakening of the central treaty that has prevented nuclear weapons spread, which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This was a treaty reached in 1968, and one in which over 180 countries have signed, and all but 5 of them have pledged never to acquire nuclear weapons, and moreover have put safeguards on their civilian nuclear facilities, power plants, or medical reactors to reassure the rest of the world that they're not diverting that nuclear material into weapons programs. It's quite an accomplishment. And those safeguards are checked by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we have high confidence in them. But in recent years, North Korea withdrew from the treaty and developed nuclear weapons and tested them, and nothing happened. It wasn't punished. It wasn't stopped. It continues to develop these weapons. Iran has cheated on its commitments to the treaty and has, I don't think it's a weapons program, but it's a program to put itself in position to acquire weapons at some future time if it chooses to do so. The U.S., for a terrible move in my mind, reached an agreement with India, which is one of those few countries that doesn't belong to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to permit nuclear trade with India, which was prohibited previously because it did not sign the treaty, and that set up precedent for China to reach a similar agreement with Pakistan. And it's, again, a weakening of these controls. So there's a danger of a real spread of these weapons technologies around the world. Government leaders in nuclear weapon states say, well, we can depend on deterrence to prevent nuclear war. Don't worry, these are weapons that prevent war. Like the former speaker, I don't believe very much in deterrence, and I don't believe these leaders believe in it. Israel has a nuclear arsenal of maybe 200 nuclear weapons, and they go, oh my God, Iran might have 1 weapon. Well, if they believed in deterrence, 200 versus 1, give me a break, really. And there's good reason not to believe in deterrence, because it's not a law of gravity. You have to make someone believe that if he, a leader, or she, a leader of a foreign country, does something that you don't like, you're going to retaliate and essentially destroy his country or destroy things that he or she values. And communicating that is very difficult. People that favor nuclear weapons in the U.S. are fond of saying that we prevented Saddam Hussein from using chemical weapons during the first Gulf War by threatening to use nuclear weapons in retaliation. And there was a letter